Good morning. There's a famous line from the movie Lord of the Rings that says, "Some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. History became legend, legend became myth." And that's what we see in the story today. We are in day 17, Exodus 1 through 22. And we see that ultimately the story, not just the story, but the story and person of Joseph had been forgotten. It shouldn't have been forgotten, but it was lost. A king comes to Egypt that forgets what Joseph and the Israelites did and the relationship he had with the Egyptians and how he was put second in command. So it shows the importance of history, of not forgetting history, especially biblical history, the stories that God has done for us, because Pharaoh forgets here, and it leads the Egyptian and Hebrew people to be at odds with one another when they should have been living in harmony, because God had blessed the Hebrews, and the Egyptians saw that and feared the Lord. And even if it's in an outward fear, they respected the Israelite people because they brought a certain blessing to their world and to their culture. So we see this happen. We see that the next Pharaoh rises. Joseph and his brothers, they all die from just natural causes, old age, and the Israelites do what God had initially called them to do, to be fruitful and multiply and to just spread and take dominion, and they start to do that. Now, they have no maniacal plans to take over Egypt or anything like that, but the Egyptian Pharaoh indeed fears that they would attempt that they would band with the Egyptians' enemy in a time of war and overthrow the Egyptians. So he enslaves them, he puts them to hard work, he attempts to subdue them, so they'll be too busy working rather than to, and be unable to continue to produce children and have families and spread out and multiply and become more numerous than the Egyptians. So there's something to remember there. The text doesn't explicitly say this, but why had the Egyptians been more, or why did the Hebrews become more numerous than the Egyptians? Why couldn't the Egyptians just have more kids? And I think there's something telling, one, in the obedience of God's people to be fruitful and multiply, as it's commanded in Scripture. And secondly, I think the Egyptians, just culturally, had a culture of licentiousness, a culture of having it easy. So we see this in the Western world. As people get richer and have more things, they have less children. And you go into third world countries and people have a ton of children, right? And there's all these different factors and reasons for this. But I think this is what's happening largely in Egypt. And rather than say, hey, why don't we do as they do? Why don't we have more children? They try to put a cap on the Hebrews spreading. They don't want them to spread. They want to keep Egypt Egyptian, okay? And so that doesn't work. Suppressing them and enslaving them doesn't work. So then he tells the midwives to kill the Jewish boys, leave the women. That way they can multiply and probably intermarry with the Jewish women. That's, I assume, the reasoning. But the midwives basically don't kill the boys and make up an excuse saying, well, by the time we get there, the Hebrew wives, they give birth fast. Hebrew women just give birth fast, right? So they use this kind of funny excuse, but it was an excuse that was actually glorifying to God. And it might seem weird because it's like, well, aren't they deceiving the Pharaoh? But remember, Pharaoh's command here is immoral. It's wrong. It's evil. And so they're siding with God, saying it's right not to murder. And so we're going to allow these children to live. And it says that indeed the Lord blessed them and gave these midwives children of their own, families of their own. So there's a blessing from the Lord to resist evil and to honor God. Now, we got to remember, they didn't basically try to kill Pharaoh. They didn't deny all of Pharaoh's decrees. Sometimes people think that a wicked ruler must be killed or overthrown or totally fought against or don't obey anything he says. They only disobeyed the law or the ordinance, whatever you want to call it here, that's unjust, that's immoral, to kill the baby boys. All right? So they still honored Pharaoh in his position, but they didn't honor the immoral request. So I think that probably will help us understand a lot that happens politically and how we should probably go about it. But let's get back to the text. And right after the midwives fail to carry out their duty to kill the Hebrew children, he commands really the people in general, saying, "You shall cast every son who is born into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." So he's now charging the people at large to kill the Hebrew children. And we'll get to next week what happens. But let's look at the questions here. How large did Jacob's family become while living in Egypt? Remember, Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and his family multiplies and spreads vastly, more than the Egyptians, or at least the Pharaoh felt that their people were more numerous than the Egyptians. So they either were, or perhaps the Pharaoh just, I don't want to say exaggerated, but feared and saw what was coming. So, but they're definitely a great number of them, or he wouldn't have been afraid. So they're multiplying faster than the Egyptians for sure. Why did the king oppress the Israelites? Well, we said he was afraid they would side with their enemies in war and overthrow Egypt. 3, why do you suppose the Lord allowed the Israelites to be oppressed by the Egyptians? This is a very good question, and we could probably talk about this all day, but just suffice it to say, and I encourage you to think about this and talk about this with your family or just to yourself and ponder it, but there's definitely a master plan here. There's something bigger than just the apparent trying to teach the people at that time a lesson or trying to grow them in their walk with God. There's a big master plan coming, and that's why the book is called Exodus. He wants to lead them out of Egypt into the promised land. Prior to this, they don't have a land of their own. They're in Canaan among the Canaanites, they're in Egypt among the Egyptians, but we see a master plan come about where God puts them in a land unto themselves. Okay? And even after that, there's a story to be had, but we'll get there later. 4, how did the Lord reward the midwives? Well, he gave them families of their own. They obeyed God rather than the immoral decree of Pharaoh, and he blessed them for it. So, good stuff. Think about it. Share it. We'll see you guys mañana.